Frank Meyer is, what was your official title? Because I know associate producer is what's on IMDb, but you did a lot of things on Attack of the Show, not just Attack of the Show, G4 as well.
Yeah, in the G4 days, you really had to wear a lot of different hats, and it was actually a great training ground for folks like myself, because I came in as a writer originally. I was writing for the website, and then that became digital producer, which essentially meant I was writing but also shooting video. And then in the early days of G4 happened to coincide with kind of the early days of podcasting. And so the idea was that each show should have its own digital producer and some sort of spin-off podcast that was supporting the show so that it had a digital presence that was beyond just like, well, let's grab some scenes and put it on the internet, because everyone was doing that. Since we were a technology-based, forward-thinking network, they wanted each show to have its own sort of digital identity, or shows that were kind of spin-offs of the shows. Or so for instance, with X-Play, we had Sessler's Soapbox, and it was, Adam Sessler had a lot to say about everything, so we gave him a soapbox in which to do it on, and he would just kind of rant about, the industry at that time. So each show had its own podcast or some sort of digital support. I came in originally as a writer for the website, and that became digital producer, that became associate producer, but we would often switch shows. The idea was that these shows were on for, Attack of the Show was year-round, and a lot of us had come into the network when it began. So if I just did Attack of the Show, it'd be like 5 years of doing the exact same thing. So the idea is I would work on Attack of the Show 1 year, and then maybe I'd go over to X-Play for a while, and then we'd launch a new show like Street Fury or Formula D, and I'd go help that kind of get its web stuff happening. So there was a handful of us doing it, and we would often jump from show to show just to keep it fresh and to keep the ideas fresh. So I worked on Attack for a while. I worked on I worked on Attack when it was called Screensavers. I worked on G4TV.com, the show, if you remember that, with
Yeah.
Laura Foy and Tina Wood, and Jeff Kiley. I wore lots of different hats then. The other interesting thing about those days is that not only if you were a writer could you maybe end up being a field producer. If you were a field producer, you could end up pitching a show. I was a musician and always trying to figure out ways to take my music side of my personality and work it into the gig. So that happened a few ways that affected Attack of the Show. The first was that I was making beats, and I pitched this idea of a show called Freestyle 101, where rappers would come on and kind of talk about rapping the way that you might interview Eddie Van Halen about guitar, and how do you do it, who are your influences. We were interviewing rappers, and I was making the beats that they were going to rap to. When Freestyle 101 started airing on the web, some of the folks from the Attack of the Show were like, hey, could we use some of these as segments? These are great little bumpers. So they would take some of the ones that had bigger guests like Cypress Hill or Kool Keith or whatever, and run those going in and out of commercials. And then that became them asking me like, well, where's the music coming from? And I was like, oh, I'm making all the music. And they said, can we hear more of this stuff? And I ended up composing a bunch of beats for Attack of the Show, one of which became their theme song for a while. And then a bunch of which just became music going in and out of commercials and bumpers and stuff. So there was a point where I was producing a segment on the show, producing the digital content, scoring the show, and then also had my hands in a few other G4 shows at that time.
Well, let's talk about, for our podcast listeners, like who you were before you came to Attack the Show.
Sure.
You came from the music business. You were an actor in addition to a musician, and also you have a famous brother. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about like your life before
Sure.
Attack and what you did? And you're still involved in music and a documentary filmmaker today. We just did an episode of the Film Threat podcast talking about your doc Risen, but also like. In addition to that, like, so your life before and then how you got to Attack. How did you get that job? So
Sure.
Sort of addressing those two issues.
I grew up in Los Angeles, and I spent most of my youth as a musician and a writer. And by that I mean getting paid on a regular basis in Los Angeles or anywhere as a musician is a rough prospect, and I had a speech and journalism degree, so I was writing for LA Weekly and New Times, and just whatever music publications I could find at that time. I ended up at a magazine called Pop Smear, New York magazine that was kind of in the vein of Film Threat, and we were certainly inspired by Film Threat. A little humor, a little pop culture, some movies, this, that, and this. Around that time, I was making my living also as a publicist. That's where I met Hellraiser, who I ended up making the documentary Risen about. But basically, up until I ended up at G4, I was kind of bopping around the music industry, trying to figure out a way to make a living while I was touring in rock bands, trying to figure out a way to make a living. I was writing for a few different magazines when a friend of my ex-wife got the job at Tech TV, and she moved up to San Francisco to work with a woman named Laura Civiello, who was in development there. So she goes to work with Laura, developing shows for Tech TV, and we had dinner with her at some point, and she told us, like, well, Tech TV is getting bought by G4, and if you're either getting laid off or you're getting moved down to LA. So she was getting moved down to LA with the other folks in her department, and she kind of gave me a heads up that there was going to be a bunch of job openings up there, and probably, or down in LA, probably some that I would be appropriate for. So I started looking and saw that they were looking for a web writer. I don't even think the word producer was in there yet. I think it was just writer. And I was sort of an anomaly at that network in the sense that I wasn't actually a huge video game guy. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, I grew up on video games, but that time, I was playing Silent Hill and Resident Evil and some of the bigger, like, horror games, but that was about it. I wasn't super nerdy about games, but I loved the technology, and I loved where games were going, and I was a sci-fi geek and a horror geek and a music geek, so it all was in my wheelhouse. But as it became a bigger thing, I realized, like, you better keep the fact that you're not a huge gamer on the down low, because that was not cool around that area, because they would get into conversations where I'd be like, yes, that's right about that character, of course, the undisclosed key of justice, I mean, who doesn't know about that? So I really just enjoyed the atmosphere and the content, and the main thing was, it was the Wild West. You know, there was no rules when we were doing it there at G4. Comcast and NBC, when they got involved, were pretty hands-off at first. So for a guy like me, I had a music background and a writing background, and suddenly I was kind of allowed to do whatever I wanted as long as it supported the shows.
What was one of the craziest things that you got away with? The one sense I got from producers on Attack of the Show was that they could, because of the freedom to be able to do all these different things, they were able to kind of get away with stuff.
Yeah, we did a lot of pretty wacky stuff. I definitely remember having a fair amount of porn stars come through that we were interviewing, and we were interviewing them for legit purposes, meaning we weren't doing, like, there wasn't cursing or nudity. We were just talking to them about the sex industry or the movie they were promoting, whatever. But I had come from rock and roll journalism, so I knew a lot of these people outside of campus, and inevitably, you know, at the end of any shoot, the crew would all be kind of like, hey, can we get pictures with you, Jenna Hayes, or whoever it is? And these girls are used to popping their top offs for any photos, so we would be on set, and all of a sudden girls are just taking their clothes off, and we're just like, hey, that's probably frowned upon here at this organization. So that was a wacky thing. But one of the things I remember was that there wasn't a ton of people to say no. If you knew how to ask the right people. So we would come up with pretty outlandish ideas for stuff, especially because my terrain was digital. So you didn't have to go through rights and clearances, you didn't have to go, I mean, again, it was the Wild West back then. You didn't have to go ask a TV executive, can we do this? You just do it, and it probably went on the web. I remember a few pretty wacky things that we put up and out there that I can't imagine would fly now. One was, I remember we did this show called Street Fury, and we had a host named Big C, and he would go to all these car shows and film, you know, interviews with guys that were racers or car manufacturers, designers, you know, tricked out cars, sort of like our version of Pimp My Ride or something. And he was interviewing a girl who was like a model of one of these things, and she bent over, and you probably won't be able to use this, but her tampon string was hanging out, and any professional journalist would have sort of like stopped the interview, but he turns to the camera and goes like, check that out, and points to it, and the camera guy is zooming in, and he comes back with the footage, and he's like, man, I have the greatest edition of our podcast ever, and he absolutely insisted that I cut the whole thing to feature this moment.
No. Oh,
and
no.
my boss at the time walked over and saw me cutting what on a quick glance would look like complete and utter pornography, and he looked at me and he goes, what's this? And I said, this is this footage of Big C at a car show, and he's kind of indicating that this girl's tampon has fallen out. And he goes, brilliant, I love it, post it. And it posted, and then 2 days later we got a call from the higher-up saying, absolutely take that off. I also remember right at the end of G4, I pitched a digital series called 8-Bit Trip that was going to be the pitch was it was Pee-wee's Playhouse meets Evil Dead, so it was going to be like a really satanic kid show, centering on video games, of course. That was the tie, and they let me do it. They gave me a budget, and I made a satanic kid show. It never saw the light of day, but I had a legit budget to go make it, and just made the weird thing that was in my head. And, you know, you probably couldn't get away with that stuff now. Another funny thing that I remember shooting that, again, there was just no one to tell us no, so we would just do things. I was good friends with, hold on, come on in.
Oh, yeah, come on in.
I'll back that one up.
Yeah. Have a seat on the couch.
All right.
We're joined by someone who may or may not decide to speak on camera. Or may or may not decide to speak on the podcast. So we'll
She may not speak ever again.
have a seat. We have special guests that may join in future installments.
Sure.
But yeah, so
speaking of, you know, things that you could do at G4 because there were very little rules and no one was quite sure what the network even was yet, and also the idea of making network content straight for digital was still a new concept, and there just weren't as many people watching what we were doing to kind of tell us not to do it. So we would just kind of do things and then, you know, see if someone got mad. And oftentimes they didn't, and oftentimes they did. One I remember that no one really freaked out about, but it just was a great example of if anyone above our team was watching, I'm sure it wouldn't have flown, which is we did a racially charged Christmas special with Angelo Moore from Fishbone. He came in with a tiny little piano and a Christmas song about how Saint Nick is actually like a drunk bastard. And we got all these adults from our team, but it was G4, so it was mainly overweight white people, and we all kind of dressed like little kids and sat down in a Christmas-themed room as Angelo sang this song to us. But he started off by addressing the whole room as like, all right, you crackers, and then he kind of went into a whole speech about what crackers we were, and then sang this song where Saint Nick is just this abusive drunk, and as he's singing the song, the audience is sort of slowly realizing what a terrible, terrible message this is, and they all just start openly weeping and crying, and by the end he just leaves everyone in a puddle. And it was just such a weird, awkward thing that didn't even really, there was no punchline. It was just like, he's gonna sing a song that's really a bummer and everyone's gonna cry at the end. And along the ways, he'll poke fun at them. And we did it, and it was hilarious and bizarre and weird and lasted on the internet. I mean, like, they didn't pull it till they pulled the whole network. But I'm convinced that if anyone now were to hear that pitch, they'd go, absolutely not, you're fired. You know?
what was your recollection about learning that the screensavers, which was the precursor to Attack the Show, was going to become Attack the Show? What was that process? Were there other names that were considered instead of Attack of the Show? So how did Screensavers become Attack of the Show? What was that process? And when did you learn, what was the moment you learned, like, Attack of the Show? When that had become the name.
I remember when Screensavers became Attack of the Show very clearly, actually, because the president of the network back then was a gentleman named Charles Hirschhorn. He'd come from Disney, and he had a penchant for calling big meetings and then standing on a table and making big proclamations. And sometimes these could be very inspiring, and sometimes half the company would get fired. The first day I was there, they had moved Tech TV down, and he got in this empty building. He got on a concrete table and told us what G4 was going to be. And he said it's going to be what MTV is to music on television, G4 will be to video games on television. And I thought that was genius. Like it was such a quick, easy, digestible, pitch. I went, oh, everyone's gonna get that. So now it's a couple of years later, and Screensavers has been on, and Screensavers was kind of that and X-Play were sort of our flagship shows, but Screensavers always had a little bit of an identity crisis. It wasn't quite as hip as it fancied itself as being, but it was very ambitious. The name, when the show launched, was a hip name, but already 2 years later, no one was even really using Screensavers in the sense, like, it wasn't a cool part of technology that you'd want to hang the hat of your forward-thinking show. You know what I mean?
It would be like calling your show Wallpaper.
Right, or BlackBerry. You know what I mean? It's just like, well, I get it. It's in the realm of technology, but not screaming cutting edge, So there had already been talk amongst folks in the network to change the name, but no one was quite sure where that was going. And what I remember is that they held a contest around the employees of the network, and they tasked us all with come up with the name. We're changing the name of Screensavers. Everyone can vote, and there'll be some sort of prize. I don't remember what the prize was, for whoever comes up with the new name. I'm sure I threw something in there. I think we all did. I remember the prize being legit enough to where I was like, well, sure, I got a few dumb ideas. And I didn't win the prize. But then they had another one of these meetings where Charles got on a desk and told us a big proclamation. The proclamation would be the new name of the show, which was Attack of the Show. I want to say, God, I think I even remember who named it that, but I hate to say it in case I'm wrong. But was it Mike Dunn?
Mike Shaw.
It was Mike Shaw. Yeah.
You want to know what the prize was?
What was the prize?
It was a fucking video iPod.
Wow.
Yeah, it wasn't that great of a prize.
Well, but at the time, that kind of was a cool prize.
Listen, we weren't paying people very well, so
Can you restate that on camera? Because I knew it was Mike Shaw.
I knew it was. I would mix them up. That's what I was thinking of.
Mine.
Yeah.
I wrote up a whole deck about wanting to call it Waypoint.
Ooh.
And how it was Waypoint Day.
Okay, I also want to go back and I want to make sure that we get all the unused names for Attack of the Show.
Well,
but can you restate that just to tell
Gavin might have those if you ask him for
Right, that's cool.
They had a contest. They had a contest between all the employees of G4 who could think of a cool name to rebrand Screensavers, and they brought us all into a big meeting, and Charles got up and made the announcement, and one of the employees, a guy named Mike Shaw, had come up with the name Attack of the Show. My reaction at first was kind of like, it doesn't even sound like a name of a show, but then as it kind of marinated on it, I thought, I think that's the point. I think it's supposed to not sound like MTV, like an MTV type of show, or, they had, what was it, TRL, Total Request Live, which was kind of, I feel like, what G4 in the early days sort of wanted Screensavers to sort of be like their TRL. But as it grew, they realized, that wasn't necessarily the best model for it. And I think that was around the time they kind of were like, let's abandon this whole TRL direction. Let's give it a weirder, more cutting-edge name. They brought in new hosts. I don't even recall if Kevin was originally on it. I don't remember if Kevin was on Screensavers as a host. I remember him being on as a recurring correspondent type of thing.
He was. I was on I was on the very last 3 episodes
Of Screensavers?
Of Screensavers, or at least the last 3
And
weeks.
was it still Sarah and what's his?
It was Sarah Lane,
Sarah
Kevin
Lane.
Rose,
Right.
and Kevin Pereira.
Right.
And so the 3 of them were basically the hosts. So
Okay.
yeah, I mean, at some point I'll do an interview and tell my own version.
Right.
But just in terms of getting the facts straight. So yeah, I was at the beginning of March 2005. I was hired, and I did like 3 weeks in a row. And I remember they told me what the title of the show was, and I thought it was kind of dumb. I thought it was like, is this supposed to be like Attack of the Clones?
Well, that's kind of what I thought
So-
too, and it sounded sort of retro-y, like an old 50s movie or something. But that being said, I will say that the name made more sense to me as the show kind of grew into what it was, because the show changed a lot from, the Screensavers was a lot more like MTV Total Request Live. It had that feel, hey, 2 cool hosts kind of, keeping it real and telling you about what's happening on the scene. And it was fine, it worked. But I think that Kevin had a sort of ironic nudge, nudge, wink, wink vibe to him that neither of the hosts had. He was almost like making fun of even being a host, almost was like the kid that someone mistakenly let get the keys to the stage, and he just locked himself in, turned on cameras, and was like, I'm gonna make a show. But I think that was a good direction, because it gave it this sort of freewheeling, like the kids are, have taken over the studio and are making their own show. And I think that's kind of what it needed. When Olivia came on, she brought a different vibe to the show. Even though she was more green at the time, green in that she hadn't done as much hosting stuff as Kevin did, she had, on one hand, a classiness that no one else on the show had, but she also was funny, and she was looser as she got more comfortable with the show. But she was looser with her humor than Sarah, the previous host, or even Morgan Webb from X-Play, who was very funny, but Morgan everything was sort of filtered through her persona to some extent. She had sort of a seriousness to her persona, and so she did humor. It was kind of coming through that. Whereas Olivia seemed pretty willing. She was aware that she was, an attractive woman on a nerdy show, but she also seemed to be very aware of throwing that image, aside and doing a lot of really dumb, ballsy stuff. I mean, I have to say, Olivia did some pretty wild stuff on the early days of the show that I don't think a lot of TV hosts would do, and certainly not new to the business, trying to prove yourself while also starting an acting career and a modeling career. I mean, there's a self-awareness that a lot of people would have at that point in their career, and she seemed to, whether it was on purpose or not, kind of just go, yeah, I don't care.
Like what? Like what are some examples of what?
I mean, she would wear a lot of, wacky, dumb costumes that I just feel like a lot of women that were as aware of the others. She was also an emerging model at that time and was getting a lot of acting gigs that were not in the geek culture world. And her career was, fairly quickly after she got established on Attack of the Show, her career was blowing up. And rather than kind of saying, oh, I should be, leaning into my more straight-laced professional side, she seemed to kind of go like, well, F it. If I'm going to be serious over there, I can be whatever I want over here. So she was just doing, I just remember a lot of stunts, a lot of stuff where she would get covered in, soda and, jump in weird things that no one should be. God, I'm trying to remember, what was the episode where they filled a pool with fizzies or pudding or something?
A giant pie.
Or both, a giant pie. I mean, a lot of straight-laced TV hosts wouldn't swim in a giant pie. But she did, and she also just had a penchant for doing a lot of really wacky sketches that, I guess the big difference would be where she was the punchline, or where something she did was the punchline, and that takes a certain amount of comfort in who you are, and comfort that you're not going to destroy your career by doing something that maybe is just seen as juvenile. But she's also was a comic actress, and if you're going to be funny, you got to do funny stuff, and she seemed very aware of that, which I really felt like was her strength. coming into that show is she, at first glance, seemed like, wow, this supermodel's on the show. She must be, hot chicks never do dumb shit. Nope. She leaned into both sides of that persona well.
When did you begin to notice that the chemistry between Kevin and Olivia was palpable? That the two of them were kind of coming into their own as a duo.
The chemistry between Olivia and Kevin was pretty instant. I mean, I remember the first time I remember watching Olivia on her first show, and she was nervous. I mean, why wouldn't she be? But that went away pretty quickly. I recall that within a few weeks, she kind of got the kinks out. She wasn't stumbling lines. She wasn't looking like you couldn't tell if she was looking at a cue card or not. Like all that sort of stuff that maybe, doing live TV at first is sort of terrifying. But she got used to that stuff pretty quickly. And once I feel like she got that nervousness out of her system, then her and Kevin were just allowed to kind of develop on camera, and their friendship developed on camera, and their persona. And I really think the thing that tied them together was their sense of humor. Is that Kevin is a funny guy, and he is, self-aware, and Olivia's funny and self-aware. And when I think they both realized that they could do it together, I think Kevin for a long time had to carry a lot of the show, and suddenly he didn't have to carry everything. He actually had like an equal comic partner, so he could be the straight guy sometimes and let her be the goofy one, or he could be the goofy one, or they both could. But before, he always was sort of having to carry the comedy on that show. And Olivia, I think, allowed him to not have to be the front man all the time, and I think he appreciated that, and I think she appreciated that he wasn't so he wasn't gripping the "I'm the star of the show" thing so tightly. Like, I think he was willing to be like, hey, this is great, now I've got a partner in crime. And I think she was stoked to be asked to be a partner in crime, not just host the show, but like, wow, this guy likes me, and we're involved now. We're doing a thing, It's like a comic partnership, and they work really well together.
When did you see the sort of rise of G4 as an entity? When you began to G4 and Attack of the Show, say when you would go to Comic-Con or just notice, like, when did you observe, say, that somehow Attack of the Show had kind of stumbled onto the zeitgeist? Like it was in line with things that were happening in the culture at the time around, in 2005, 2007, like between that era, whatever.
Yeah. The first few years of G4 felt like we were doing this very underground thing. And I think it took us a few years before we really jumped on being part of live experiences, going to Comic-Con, going to E3, GDC, Tokyo Game Show, all that stuff. We weren't doing that right out of the gate, probably because there was just limited budgets and stuff to send crews all over the world. But once things got established, we were doing that stuff. And that's when I saw, like, wow, there's a humongous fan base for this, and we're really tapping into something exciting. So for those first few years, we were making this content, but the content was living within the website, so it was kind of hard to gauge the popularity of it. And it was early enough in the YouTube era where stuff was getting posted either by the network or by fans, but it wasn't like it is now where something would just get like 500,000 hits right out of the gate and you go, whoa, we got a hit. YouTube was new, social media was in the early stages. This is still the MySpace era. So there wasn't as much of a tangible way to gauge, like, do they like us? How important is this show to a kid, to a video game loving kid on the street? So it felt like we were kind of in a bubble for the first few years, just doing this thing that we were all passionate about, but we knew we weren't getting big ratings, and there wasn't as easy of a way to classify the digital content and how it was connecting with people. So when we went out to the public, And I remember Comic-Con, I want to say it was Comic-Con 2006-ish, probably the first one that you went to as a went to period, but went to working for G4. I was completely blown away. We had, at the time, we didn't even have a particularly big booth the first year I went, but the crowd around the booth was gigantic. And there was just like lines for everything, lines to meet everyone. All the hosts were rock stars there, like more so than the people at the the actual booths for some sci-fi movie and stuff. Battlestar Galactica people were there, Star Wars people were there. I mean, of course, those guys are gonna have big lines, but we were like a dopey TV network, and our lines rivaled like Star Wars lines. Like, it was nuts, and people would come up to the hosts as if they were rock stars. And that was something that I hadn't experienced, because we were all just like in this building off Olympic and Bundy, just grinding and making content, and really didn't have a gauge as to whether it was connecting or not. And I remember going to film a remote piece with Morgan Webb, where myself and a crew and Morgan had a bunch of assignments around the floor of Comic-Con, like be at this booth to interview Todd McFarlane at noon, and then be over at the DC booth at 1 and interview this guy, and blah blah blah. And we couldn't get to our appointments on time because there was such a huge throng of people surrounding us at all times, and wherever Morgan went, there was this giant crowd of people, and they were, guys with horny stars in their eyes, and girls with just like adoration in their eyes, and journalists wanting to get quotes from her. And it blew us all away, because we really had no idea that any of this was connecting with anyone. And then we go to Comic-Con and realize, like, oh my God, it's connecting hugely with a lot of people. And not just that they're aware of it, but they were really passionate about it. And that was the thing I remember kind of walking away from, is like, wow, we've really tapped into something here. Not just we found fans, but we've tapped into something bigger than I think even we, the people that was making the content, were aware. This was at the beginning of, not the beginning of video games exploding, because obviously there was a wave before this, with the original explosion of video games onto the scene in the 80s. But this is when the home consoles were really kind of going to the other level. The graphics were going to another level. This is when, gaming between, remote gamers and sports gaming and live gaming, all this stuff, landlines and all that stuff. This was when all that stuff was exploding, and the mainstream media was not covering that at all. MTV wasn't covering it. No one was covering video games on television at all in any way, shape, or form. So when people that were fans found out that they weren't just watching, they were absolutely blown away and dazzled, and these were huge rock stars to the nerd geek culture world, which wasn't taken seriously until now. And now the rest of the world was seeing Comic-Con and the numbers and the lines, and going like, oh my God, we need to have a piece of this now. And I remember that it was the following year that Entertainment Weekly first put Comic-Con on the cover. And that was another moment where I went, okay, we've arrived. Entertainment Weekly is only putting superstars on the cover. This is at the time. I don't know how much Entertainment Weekly means to entertainment business anymore. But at that time, Entertainment Weekly was putting on, Indiana Jones when there was a new Indiana Jones movie, or Luke Skywalker, or whoever was blockbuster movies or blockbuster rock stars. And they certainly weren't putting regional events on the cover of a national magazine, because that's the other thing people forget is Comic-Con was not a nationwide or a worldwide event at that time. It was a San Diego event. And San Diego's not even part of Hollywood. Comic-Con, as it's thought of now, is this pop culture juggernaut. But back then, it was a comic book convention. People forget the word comic is first in that. It was a comic book convention that some TV shows were starting to get hip to, like, oh, our audience is there. So they were, the early days of Walking Dead and Lost and stuff, they were really leaning on the Comic-Con audience. But you weren't seeing it in Rolling Stone, you weren't seeing it in Spin, you weren't seeing it in Entertainment Weekly. It was completely under the radar of mainstream media until really the explosion of G4. And now all of a sudden people went, there's a whole network dedicated to this thing. And not just a wing of the San Diego Convention Center, the entire thing. I don't know if you guys have been to the San Diego, it's gargantuan, huge. It's like 3 convention centers attached. And any other convention would just be in one wing of it because there's not that many people that care about most things to fill 3 convention centers. The fact that Comic-Con, while still under the radar, was selling out, and then to the extent that Entertainment Weekly, a national magazine, meaning most of their audience is not going to go to San Diego for Comic-Con. So why would you put it on the cover? Because it was that big.
Well, I will say Comic-Con is technically called Comic-Con International.
Well, now it is.
It was an international event only because of the talent that would travel to it. I mean, it blew up. It was really, I think, 2007 when I personally observed, like, oh, this is getting too big.
Yeah, well, and then they started doing it in other, because at that point there was a New York one too.
Well, there were a lot of other Comic-Cons, and they because of the rise of San Diego Comic-Con, it was an all ships rise situation.
Right.
And Phoenix Comic-Con became big, and Seattle Comic-Con, and Emerald City Comic-Con, that is.
Tulsa, Oklahoma
Tulsa,
Comic-Con.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but there are a lot of New York Comic Con blew up. So I will say this, just to back up to something you said earlier. I've never had a problem walking from one side of Comic Con. No, actually, I would, during those days, I definitely would get people that would wanna, and it was always dudes that wanted to talk to me about movies.
Sure.
And the worst part for me was I also wanted to talk to them about movies.
Yeah.
So that would
you just last 15 minutes with one dude.
Yeah, the person that would delay me getting places would be wanting to stop and just talk to fans about our shared passion.
Well, but the other thing I'll just throw in about when we all started to become aware that there was this much bigger fan base for what G4 was doing than any of us really realized, was after the first few years of covering things like Comic-Con and GDC and E3, all of which were similar experiences where we'd go and just be like, wow, we can't believe the attention we're getting here and how passionate people are. But we started going out of the country to GDC in Germany, I think it was there GameCon or GDC? There was one of them in Germany, Gamescom in Germany, and then Tokyo Game Show in Tokyo, and there was a few others, and we would go out there as this American TV show that did not have particularly good ratings necessarily, but when we would go out to these international things, we were equally as revered and popular. And it was a wacky thing to be in Germany or Tokyo and having people go up to Kevin and Morgan with just stars in their eyes, like, oh my God, Kevin Pereira, this is so incredible, I can't believe I'm meeting you. And I'm going do they even get the show out here? How are they seeing this? And least of all, how are they quoting the show and wearing t-shirts and all this stuff? So it became, once G4 started branching out of our studio into the rest of the world, I think we were all shocked and delighted by how the content we were making was really catching on in a much bigger way than any of us were aware of.
Cool. Tell me about your first day to your last day, the comparison of those 2 days. Your first day, not even called Attack of the Show, it's G4 Screensavers, and my recollection of Screensavers was all very much a DIY, we're going to show you how to install Windows this.
Yeah.
It was more instructional than it was entertainment.
It was very inside baseball too. Yeah.
So there was the day you began and the day it ended. How different were those days?
Well, the day I began was the day that Tech TV got moved down, and the president at the time, Charles Hirschhorn, took all of the new employees and he stood on a table and he gave this big speech about what the network was going to be. I mentioned this before. It's going to be what MTV is to music on television, we will be to video games on television. And he kind of rattled off all of these things. It'll be this, it'll be that. And I turned to a friend of mine and I said, so basically it's hot chicks and robots. And I kind of got that in my head. And I was like, I'm gonna go make a show called Hot Chicken Robot and sell it to my new job at G4. So I went and made this dumb puppet show about the secret lives of video game characters that we eventually changed the name to Video Game Theater. And we were in the process of selling it to G4 when the deal got funky and we ended up walking away from it. We ended up selling it to MTV Europe instead. A pop culture show about American video games we sold to MTV Europe, where it appeared in different dubbed languages. The whole thing was bizarre. But so that first day for me was filled with like inspiration and ambition and ideas, meaning I literally walked away from the very first time I heard someone speak at G4 about what G4 was, and I was like, I'm gonna go make a show and it's gonna have puppets and it's gonna have robots and technology. I was completely inspired. And inspired to do cool stuff there, inspired to go do cool stuff on my own, inspired just because the whole thing seemed like such a cavalcade of great ideas and just all this energy. Cut to, so that would have been 2004. Cut to somewhere around 2012, I was in Bridgeport, Connecticut with Joe Lynch, filming some content for Freestyle 101, which was the hip hop podcast we were doing that also ran on Attack of the Show. And we got a call from our boss at the time who said, don't panic, but everyone around you is about to get fired. And we were like, what? And he said, don't worry, you guys are fine, but there were already rumors that G4 might be going away. There were rumors that Style Network might be going away, which was another property owned by NBC. But none of us knew what was going on. And there was also rumors that maybe a new network was going to come in. Again, no one knew anything. But suddenly moves were being made, and essentially they were announcing first to the people that worked at the company and then to the world, and this is all now just part of the story, is that they're pulling the plug on the G4 network and they were pulling the plug on Style Network, and eventually it was announced that they were going to start the Esquire network. And so those last few weeks I was there were incredibly nerve-wracking and tense, because a bunch of people got let go, as these things happen when networks change and go away and emerge and blah, blah, blah. And then those of us that didn't get let go were terrified we were about to let go, because usually it happens in waves. And then those of us that didn't get let go again kind of just sat there wondering, like, so what do we do now? Like, what's going to happen? And where do we even work? And what is my job now? Eventually, we were told that we were going to start building the Esquire network, and that's what those of us who stayed on board did. But those last few weeks there were just really tense. All that fun, reckless, Wild West stuff was long gone. The last year or two, a lot of that stuff kind of got stamped away anyways, just because when we first were part of the Comcast Universal world, they just weren't paying that much attention, and I think they kind of were like, well, these guys know what they're doing. They own this space. Just let them go continue owning it. But the network wasn't doing as well as they would have liked now a few years later, and they were putting stuff like American Ninja Warrior and stuff, trying to sort of hedge their bets. Like, well, let's put some stuff we know is going to get some eyes and see if we can slip that in and kind of raise the profile of the network and stuff. And just things, it just wasn't working. You know what I mean? It just wasn't all clicking the way that they liked. So eventually the move was made to move on. But when you know that your job's going away or changing, and when everyone around you is getting let go, and people are crying and blah blah blah, it's rough and it's weird, and part of me was just stoked I didn't get let go right away, and part of me was like kind of bummed out I didn't get let go right away. You know what I mean? So it was a weird time. One other thing I remember just about that final era of G4 was towards the end, we were working in very close proximity with the E network. E Entertainment, because they were also owned by Comcast NBC. So on one floor you had G4, which was like us nerds and geeks, and then you had the E Entertainment people who were like the Kardashian clique, and then you had the Style Network who were even weirder than the Kardashian clique. And it really didn't, like, none of us particularly belonged together on the same floor, but we all kind of made it work. Then Michael Jackson died. And to be at E when Michael Jackson died would be like being at Time Magazine for D-Day. It was panic. I mean, women screaming and shrieking, just down the hall. Grown men openly weeping, like, I just can't believe it. The king is dead. Like, people losing their shit. Like, I remember when OJ jumped in the white Bronco, did not get half the reaction as Michael Jackson. I remember Reginald Denny getting pulled out of that truck and beaten with bricks in the street as LA burned in flames. Nothing compared to Michael Jackson's death and the reaction of the people at E. It was bedlam and mayhem.
To me, it kind of felt like the E people were like the theater kids in high
Kinda,
school, and
yeah.
like the G4 people were just the nerds.
Yeah.
So it was like the theater kids and the nerds, and there wasn't a lot of crossover in the Venn diagram of those demographics.
They
There
didn't
was
like...
a minor bit of dating.
No, there was a little cross-pollination, but very little, to be honest.
For
Yeah.
enterprising nerds like Frank, there was a little bit of dating.
Yeah. Some of us managed to use that to our advantage.
Guy Branham at all? You know Guy?
Oh my, he's probably got
yeah.
great
I mean,
stories.
we should.
You should.
So let's talk about Attack of the Show did so many things that there's no way you'd get away with it now. If you did some of these things on Attack of the Show today, you would be canceled. It would trend on Twitter, and it would be cancel Attack of the Show. But tell me a couple of things that you recall that happened on Attack of the Show that there's no way you could do it today.
There was a lot of stuff that Attack of the Show did that you couldn't get away with today, and that's amazing that we got away with it in the first place, because we were owned by major media conglomerates. It's just somehow we were operating a little under the radar, at least at first. I mean, there were some things that were just wacky and weird, but, never underestimate the power of having your day job suddenly get really wacky and weird. One day we put Mentos in like a whole huge swimming pool's worth of sodas, and it just made them all explode like, different colored fountains. And, I'm sure David Letterman in his day or whatnot did stuff in that vein, but like I'd never seen anything like that. And like I just went to work one day and there was a giant plastic swimming pool full of soda and then just all these packages of Mentos, and I remember just kind of going, today's going to be an interesting day at the office. And, my whole day was just kind of like, when's it going to go down? And it did, and it was unlike any other day at work I've ever had. We also, G4 was very open to having adult stars come on, and they didn't, it was an interesting way that they would do it. Talk shows at that time would not have porno stars on. They just wouldn't. It was considered forbidden. You couldn't get them on because what would you talk to them about? Because no one would promote pornography. And if you weren't promoting their product, what would you have them do? Maybe, Conan or someone might have one as like a model or something. But they weren't taken seriously outside of, say, the Howard Stern show. But the Howard Stern show at that time was considered shocking and sort of crazy. So, and G4 was a network TV show. It wasn't necessarily supposed to be shocking or crazy, but we did a lot of shocking and crazy stuff. But what I remember about the way that Attack specifically handled people in the sex industry and porno stars is that they talked to them like normal celebrities. So we would have on, whether it was, what was her name? Sasha, the girl that was in the Sasha Grey, yeah. So we had on Sasha. Sorry, I remember when we had on Sasha Grey, who was in a Steven Soderbergh movie at the time, and they had her on and talked to her as a serious actress. I think it was acknowledged that she had come from porn, but they really talked more about the project she was working on, which happened to be mainstream. But they weren't hiding the fact that she was a porn star. They just talked to her like an actress. We had this actress who was kind of from like the golden age of 80s, early 90s porn, Asia Carrera, I think was her name, and she would come on and give like sex tips and sex advice, but not like dressed really slutty or not even really leaning on like, hey, I'm a porn star, and it was just like this was her field of expertise. And she was a well-spoken person, so she came and spoke about her field of expertise. And there wasn't a lot of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, like, can you believe, blah, blah, blah. Is that a hot dog? Blah, blah, blah. No, they just talked to her like a normal person, which I remember being kind of impressed by, because so much of what we were doing was very immature and amateurish, yet this was an area where actually people handled themselves with like restraint and class and just kind of talked to these people like they were normal performers in the industry, which really they were, just more naked. All that other stuff was dwarfed by what I recall being the weirdest, most surreal, and potentially disturbing act pulled off on Attack of the Show, which was they put a web server up an employee's butt and then cast from said server. So we had a webcast from the inner anus walls of one of our fine employees. I think most of us who worked there know who that employee was. I don't know that I should reveal it, but I certainly hope that you track that person down and get them to reveal it, because it has to be a revealing story. I would love to have been at the pitch meeting for that. Guys, we've put web servers everywhere, almost everywhere. Picture me this, and then you could just imagine people walking out of the room and, this is the craziest idea, but somewhere along the way, Gavin Purcell or one of the producers was like, kid, you've got moxie. We're gonna put a web server up a man's butt. We're gonna do it with moxie. So.
Tell me about how you've observed things have changed since Attack of the Show went on the air. It was March 2005 when Attack of the Show first launched. When Attack of the Show ended, which was at the very beginnings of 2013, and those shows were actually pre-shot kind of best of shows.
Yeah.
That took us through part of the beginning of 2013, but how things changed from 2005 to now, and why do you think Attack of the Show has had such cultural relevance?
A lot's changed since Attack of the Show was on the air. At the time when Attack of the Show was covering video games and movies and pop culture, it was doing it from sort of a fringe perspective, meaning a lot of this stuff was considered not mainstream at all, or underground culture, or some of the stuff that was bigger and less fringe, like the superhero stuff, which was making a lot of money, as were comic books and video games at that time. But they were still considered part of this kind of geek culture or youth culture or nerd culture, meaning it was still considered sort of not quite mainstream. And Attack, the way that it was covering it with the sort of freewheel and humor and recklessness that at least it sort of came off to the fans, felt very appropriate to the culture, meaning the culture itself was weird and surreal and high octane, video games and horror movies and action movies, and the stuff that they were covering was in itself kind of offbeat to mainstream, and the way that Attack of the Show was covering it was reflective of the content. It was offbeat, it was weird, it was funny, it was surreal, but there wasn't anything else on television like that at the time. No one else was covering content like that with that spirit, or with the spirit that reflected the content. So if you were to watch Entertainment Tonight or News or whatever, it was handling everything the same way, straight-laced. So if they talked about the new Uma Thurman romantic comedy, it got handled with the same tone as a Star Wars movie. Whereas the way Attack of the Show might cover those two things is one of the Star Wars one might get an entire parody sketch, or they might do it dressed in costumes. You know, they would lean into the fact that, like, well, we'll cover both these things, but we love Star Wars, so we're going to really go crazy with our Star Wars thing and make it over the top because we love it. We love it over the top, you know. That approach was unique at the time, and you didn't see it a lot. There was weird stuff on TV. Letterman was doing all sorts of weird stuff for a long time, but it's because Letterman was weird. You know, he had a skewed mind, so he did funny stuff. Whereas I feel like Attack of the Show's entire persona and point of view was directly reflective of the content they were covering. It wasn't just that, you know, that Kevin was a wacko guy, and if you put a camera on him anywhere, you were going to get the same thing. No, it's that Kevin loved this content and was given a vehicle to let the coverage of the content reflect the energy and the weirdness and the surreality of the content itself. So if you're going to cover video games and you're doing it straight-laced, you're probably not doing all that great of a job because the content's not straight-laced. The content's bizarre, so you might as well, you could afford to be a little bizarre. That being said, I feel like now that so much content is viewed through non-network services, now a lot of folks watch their content through Twitch or through TikTok or through YouTube. And those platforms are not the traditional, you know, half an hour structured TV show with an opening and then a monologue and then a commercial and then a guest and then, you know, the typical sort of pop culture talk show format that everyone for a long time until recently stuck to. And you kind of had to stick to it because there was no other format. Well, Attack of the Show threw that entire format out the window. And because our audience were younger at the time, that audience is now running show business. And so guys like, you know, we were talking earlier, guys like James Gunn, who were fans, are now directing blockbuster movies. And some of that sensibility that they picked up from Attack of the Show, I feel like has sort of moved on to the way, not just that like movies are made necessarily, but the way they're covered in the media. So the fact that the way the places you're seeing celebrities interviewed are less formal situations than they used to be. Before, if you did a junket for a movie, you went to 10 different couches or chairs with your movie poster in the back, or you sat in one room where 10 journalists like you or I were escorted in and out, and it was the same camera angle for everyone, and they'd supply everyone with the same B-roll, and everyone walked away with a slight variation of the exact same boring package. I know that the movie companies and TV will still adhere to that to some extent, but now there's so many other ways. Now, for instance, a perfect example is there's a talk show where people go on and eat increasingly hot wings while giving an interview. That's a very Attack of the Show approach, which is let's put the celebrity not at all at ease and let them go through a bit of an endurance test while trying to promote their subject or their movie or whatever at that time. So the fact that you got so many people like Action Bronson doing a cooking show while incredibly high, you know, on Vice, like that feels very Attack of the Show as well. I feel like people like Vice, people like a lot of the people who are doing shows straight to YouTube that are kind of a podcast, but a little bit more, but not quite. Rhett and Links of the world, you know, guys who are doing what seem like talk shows, but they're just a little weirder and a little less structured. I feel like all of that came from the influence of Attack of the Show.
I would almost argue that YouTube, the current incarnation of YouTube, which is fractured into, you know, personalities covering comic books, movies, video games, you know, and whatnot. That influence came from Attack of the Show.
Sure. Yeah, and even the fact that G4 allowed all of their hosts to have outside programming. That's essentially what our team did, is figured out, well, what would Blair Butler from Attack of the Show want to do? Well, she's going to want to review comic books because that's her passion. Casey Schreiner who's working on X-Play, he's an MMO expert and he's a great straight man, so let's have him do the MMO report, which is like a newscast from the world of MMOs. Giving all of your hosts their own little show outside of their show that's tailored to their specific personal interests was in itself not being done at that time. Like, I just remember thinking, like, wow, no one's doing this. Like, we're not only making these TV shows, we're making double that amount of digital shows, and they were low budget, but we had the cooperation of a lot of big media companies, so we were getting the good comic books on the comic book review show, we were getting the support of the MMO companies on the MMO report. I just feel like at that time, you weren't seeing all the stars of talk shows doing their own talk shows outside the talk show. And G4 seemed to understand, and Attack specifically seemed to understand that, like, these hosts are personalities, and they're not just the hosts of the shows, they're kind of reflective of the entire attitude of the network, which is why they were so beloved and revered. It wasn't just that Morgan was a video game expert or that she was, a hot chick on TV. In the past, those might have been enough. But she had a whole point of view and a whole personality, and we would allow her to step outside of her role as this straight-laced or comedically adept straight-laced host and let her do much weirder stuff. Same with Sessler, same with all of them. So that in itself, I feel like, was kind of unique to television at the time and to digital content, because there wasn't a lot of digital content at the time. But now that's just the norm. Now, they lean into the personalities on talk shows and hosts. Now there's plenty of talk shows and variety shows and stuff. I mean, the Eric Andre show is another one where it's just like, you couldn't have had the Eric Andre show without things like Attack of the Show, or for that matter, maybe early Letterman, like shows that were pushing the boundaries, shows that were breaking the format, shows that didn't mind if the host looked like a moron, because the host wanted to look like a moron. And the idea that the host could do stuff that maybe in the past would have been considered detrimental to their public image. But if you kind of throw that idea of a public image needing to be perfect out the window, then what are you detrimental to? You know what I mean? The public image is whatever you want it to be,
Could you relay to me any final thoughts or something I didn't ask that you feel is important that people should know?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, because we talked about it earlier, which was one of my favorite moments on the set of Attack of the Show. It was actually backstage. Was my brother is an actor, and he was on this show at the time called Franklin and Bash, where he played like a sexy lawyer, and the show was a hit, but I hadn't watched it. It's my brother. I was like, I'll catch it on the flip-flop. And so he came on, him and the other star of the show came on to, actually I think it was Jess Brecken maybe came on the show. Anyways, he came on the show to promote it, and everyone was like, oh, your brother's on Attack of the Show. You should go backstage and interview him and do, it'll be funny, like two brothers just talking. I was like, sure, okay. I didn't normally do a lot of on-camera hosting, but it's my brother, and we get along great, so thought it'd be funny. So I said to him, hey, before you go on, can I just grab you backstage and do a little interview? And he goes, sure. And he knows me well enough to know that I probably hadn't watched the show yet. So we go back there and we're sitting down, and pretty quickly into the interview, I asked him, it's like, so you're here promoting Franklin and Bash? He goes, I am. I bet you've never even watched the show. And I go, of course I've watched the show. You're my brother. Why wouldn't I watch the show? And he goes, really? Which one am I? And I hadn't watched the show, and I had no idea which character he was. And I don't know why I didn't guess Franklin, since my name is in that name. I just hedging my bets. It might have been. But I went, yeah, everyone knows you're Bash. And he goes, I am not Bash. Totally nailed me. And I felt pretty embarrassed. anyways, that was a fun moment for me. I'm trying to think. For me, there was a lot of. We got to do so much cool stuff. I mean, I got to see the world through working at G4. We got to travel all over the country and all over the world. Getting to go to Tokyo to do Tokyo Game Show was just like a dream come true. For me, when we did the show, the podcast Freestyle 101, which later was a segment on Attack of the Show, that was kind of a dream come true because I'm a musician and I love rock and roll, but I love hip hop and I grew up on hip hop, and I somehow managed to talk the powers that be into, why don't you let me go just hang out with hip hop guys and interview them about rapping. And they went, okay, go make a pilot. And I made a pilot with Devin the Dude, you know, that rapper, and it came out really good. And then they said, okay, make a couple more, and we'll kind of we'll put a few out there and gauge how it's doing. So I did one with him and one with Killa Priest was an early one. I think Bus Driver was an early one. And it was getting to meet these incredible artists, getting to see them do their thing on a mic, and basically improvising, and then getting to talk about the art form. It was an amazing dream come true, and we shot over 110 episodes, and I got to meet just every rapper that I ever wanted to meet. The highlight was when Joe Lynch and I went to New York, and on the same trip where we interviewed the rapper Hellraiser that I made the documentary about, we Mobb Deep allowed us to use their studio for a day, and we just invited every rapper, including Mobb Deep, over there to come get interviewed and rap. And so at one point we had Mobb Deep and MOP and Wu-Tang guys and all these rappers in a room together just watching, because they were waiting for me to call them in, and they all showed up at the same time, some early, some late. So I just had this room full of rappers, and they're all watching TV and watching YouTube videos and just shooting the shit and having a good time. And then Ice-T walks in, and I don't care how famous you were, when Ice-T walks in, everyone just went, oh my God, it's the Godfather. I mean, he was so cool, and he was super stoked to hang with all these other rappers. And we got to go into the booth when he did a freestyle rap, and it was like being in the booth listening to Miles Davis blow horn. When Ice-T raps about blowing your chest plate out and brains on the canvas and all this stuff, it was just so magical. It's this guy invented this art form, and now he's doing it 2 feet from me, and he's having fun doing it. And we were just me and Joe just freaked out. It was one of the only times that I've ever been genuinely starstruck, where I was I just need to take a minute and process everything that I just saw, because it's blowing my mind right now. So though we had some pretty amazing times shooting that show, I also really quickly remember when we were in New York that I was driving in a black van, and I had a bunch of guys from Wu-Tang Clan in the van, and we were going across the bridge to go to, we're supposed to meet some other people, essentially. And we come out of the bridge, and my cameraman is holding a camera in his lap, because when we've been going through the bridge, he was filming the lights. And this is post 9/11, so we get to the end of the tunnel, and the white guy, older white guy at taking the toll booth, looks at the car full of the hoodied rappers, looks at me, and then looks at Jason with my cameraman Jason, this camera, and he goes, son, what are you doing with that camera? And he goes, oh, I'm just filming some stuff in the tunnel. He goes, you know that since 9/11 it is illegal to film the internal mechanisms of a tunnel, blah, blah, blah. This whole thing, we were no. And I said, well, shouldn't there be signs or something? And he goes, like that sign right there, son. And literally right in front of us is a giant sign that says, no cameras in the Holland Tunnel, no exceptions, will be busted for terrorist acts, blah, blah, blah. And we're just and my cameraman turns to him with a big old shit-eating grin and just goes, man, come on, be cool. And he goes, hand me your IDs. And he takes both of our driver's license, and he goes, pull over there. So now we've lost our IDs and we're being pulled over, and I look in the rear view and I see cops with guns drawn approaching it, and I turn to my saucy cameraman and all the members of the rap group and I go, no one say a word and allow me to get us out of this, please. And they go, what are you going to say? I go, I'm the only white guy in the car. I'm our only hope. So the guy comes up, guns drawn, and says, yeah, we heard there's a problem in here. And we go, there's no problem, officer, absolutely not. And we explained that we didn't know we couldn't do this, and we were just shooting some B-roll, and none of us were trying to be threatening. And meanwhile, my cameraman has just got this grin on his face, and the guy with the gun literally goes, son, I'm gonna need you to wipe that smile off your face. And my cameraman goes, what smile? And I was like, oh my God, we're all gonna get shot in the head. And somehow we talked our way out of it. And we got our IDs back, and we went to the next shoot, and then we went to go have dinner, and then we're going to go to the next shoot. We go into the restaurant in Harlem, and when we come out, there is police tape all around the front of the restaurant, including where our car is. And we go up to a police officer on our now increasingly weird day, and we go, hey, what's with the police tape? And they go, there was just a murder out here. And we go, but we've been inside eating for the last 45 minutes. When did this happen? He goes, about 20 minutes ago. And we go, oh, well, we need to get our car. And he goes, you're not getting your car. And we go, but we got somewhere to go. We got a shoot to go. And he goes, it's part of a murder scene, son. You're not getting your car till we've inspected the murder scene. So we had to take all of our gear out and take the subway to the next shoot. Anyways, those aren't really G4 stories, but they were stories that happened at G4.
Well, Frank, thank you so much for talking to us.
Yeah, man.
It's great. All right, dude.